Good morning, y'all. Thanks for coming out here. I really appreciate it. I'm afraid that I'm not going to talk about anything as exciting as space toilets, but hopefully we'll all get through it together. So, ugly. We're going to talk about ugly buildings today. Who remembers The Devil Wears Prada? Do you all see that film, right? You know that scene with Meryl Streep playing Anna Wintour and Anne Hathaway as her young assistant, and she's wearing a blue sweater, and Anna Wintour, Meryl Streep, tells her, "That's not blue, that's cerulean." And you didn't come up with that. Oscar de la Renta did in 2002 with The Show of Gowns. And Yves Saint Laurent followed up with a military jacket in cerulean. And it traveled and traveled until you found it at Casual Corner, which is just such a sick, awful burn. Ugly is created. What I want to talk about today is how ugly is an idea that was passed on to us without our consent, whether it's in fashion, whether it's in bodies, or whether it's in architecture. I made up 4 words to describe how ugly buildings are made, and they are demographics, designation, deception, and demolition. I may or may not return to all of those words, but that's sort of how I organize my thought. A lot of this is going to be slides, pictures of buildings, and you might have some questions about it. I encourage you to ask now instead of waiting to ask later. So if you come up with something and you want to talk about it, just raise your hand and we'll go from there. This is the Orange County Government Building. It was designed by Paul Rudolph in 1967, and it is currently under threat. It is one of the principal buildings of brutalism and one of the most hated buildings in all of New York. It finds itself on the World Monuments Fund list, along with Machu Picchu and the Great Wall of China. So how could a building like this be both a national treasure and a local monstrosity? We're going to look at all of those reasons. Michael Kimmelman in the New York Times just wrote about this building. And he reported that an architect named Jeanne Kaufman, who is an architect with a firm called Gwathmey Siegel Kaufman, has offered to buy this building from the county for $5 million. In addition, he offered to design a replacement county building next door for $67 million. But the Orange County executive hates this building so much that he won't take a good deal to save it. So the New York Times architecture critic is leading the charge to save one of the most important ugly buildings that there is. Now, what makes this building ugly? It's concrete. It's what's actually called corrugated concrete, and it's something that is beige. It's something that a lot of people don't maybe find so appealing, but I think that that is a creation of several conditions. This specific building has undergone so many renovations over its history that its interior is completely unnavigable. You can't walk through the building. It has been changed. It is not the original product. We're going to continue with a few more. This one's here in DC, and I'm sorry if these pictures are a little bit difficult to see, but this is the MLK Library. You all know it, right? When it was created in 1972, it was done by the great architect Mies van der Rohe, and it's the only international style building by one of the great 3, Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, or Mies in Washington, D.C. When I first moved here during Anthony Williams' administration, he was trying to get the Martin Luther King Memorial designation removed from this building so it could be made into a Bloomingdale's. He said that the building was unworkable and couldn't be wired with Wi-Fi and should be painted white if it's going to be saved at all. It's a wonderful building, but what you need to know about it is that the story is told through photography, and photography can be deceptive. Deception is one of the important constructs of one of the important factors in constructing ugly. So we're going to look at a couple of photos. That looks pretty nice, right? That's not the kind of building that you'd want to tear down, but that wasn't the kind of image that Mayor Williams was showing when he was trying to have this library removed. And that's an even older image showing the original creation. What you see are the long foyer, a really epic moment in a Washington, D.C. building. I don't think there is anywhere else in the city like a single uninterrupted plane like this. So the geometry is really expressive, but over a period of 30 years, when you clutter it up with stands, when you clutter it up with services, that point can get a little bit lost. I'm going to go back a couple of places to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. Demographics is another one of those factors I mentioned. In 1950, the population of Washington, D.C. was 802,000 people. By 1970, it was 756,000 people. By 1980, it was 638,000 people. In 2000, it was 572,000 people. That is a fast decline. When you lose population like that, you lose tax base, and you lose the ability to keep up the buildings that you have. So a building like MLK Library fell into serious disrepair. So did every single building on the National Mall. The entire Smithsonian is in a serious deficit and needing of substantial improvements and leaks. So when we talk about ugly, we talk about an inheritance that stems from the civil rights era riots and white flight, and a deferred maintenance bill that has come due. Compared to a lot of the buildings that have come up in more recent years, especially over the last decade, maybe this building is ugly, but that's because we didn't do our jobs and take care of it, and we didn't take care of our city. Okay, moving right along. I love this picture of Paul Rudolph, a great brutalist architect. He's looking very Kraftwerkian here. This is the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth Library. It was constructed in 1970, I think, and it was recently renovated. This is one of the rare brutalist buildings that has been saved. And I want to show you a few images of what it looks like now. This is obviously done when it was first created, and you see these kind of high, soaring, heroic forms. It's bigger than human scale. In a sense, brutalism responds to the kind of impulse that drives this room. I mean, this isn't a human scale room. This is something much larger and grander. So this is what it looks like today. That's not quite the same picture or the same angle, but you can see that the firm Design Lab that conducted this renovation mined out a lot of the spaces. They turned on the lights. They opened up a lot of glass in this building, which was something that it may have lacked. And you see some of the things that can be done. This is a much, much cheaper option than tearing down brutalist buildings, which is always the first impulse that your government leaders will go to when it comes to new development. It's harder to save something. It takes more work, but it winds up often being cheaper. I'm going to flip back a couple of clips to talk about this building. When it was done in 1972. 10 years earlier, DC hired Booz Allen Hamilton to do a report on what a library needs. And this is one of the first lines from their report. Today, windows serve practically no useful purpose. Artificial light was superior to natural light, and you'd never want to have a building for reading where you might be reading by the sun. You needed halogen lamps. One of the decisions that was made with this building, Mies van der Rohe actually designed it with a few options built into it, and he wanted it to be 5 stories. He wanted it to actually be much larger. He built into the sky, and he wanted it to have an atrium where sunlight would pour in. But that wasn't the fashion at the time. At the time, the idea was that that electric light was so much better than natural light. So we missed a huge opportunity to have even better reading rooms in the inside of the library, like we have along the exterior of the library. The wonky term I came up for, the next thing I want to describe is designation. One of the architects for Design Lab who performed this renovation was talking in an interview about Paul Rudolph. And the interviewer said, how amazing was it to work with a building by Paul Rudolph? And they said, well, it wasn't at all. We were kind of reluctant to do it. He was not a hero. In the 1980s, the academy was dominated by the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. It still is today. But that school put out postmodernism, and it rejected the tenets of modernism. And brutalism especially is a very modernist kind of school. So when people talk about buildings being ugly, there is inevitably critical influence and academic influence on that discussion. And largely it was coming from Harvard in the 1980s. And it's not something that we think about. When we think about our opinions, we feel like we have these authentic reactions to cerulean. But they've been created for us years, decades even, before we arrived at them. So this is the Third Church of Christ Scientist. Does anyone remember this building? 16th and I Streets, Northwest. This was designed by Araldo Casuda, who is a protege of IMPE, and the owners are the Third Church of Christ Scientists. So when they looked to sell the buildings in 1990, you have to remember that it was at one of the bleakest points in Washington, D.C.'s history. There was no downtown life to speak of. The idea of a functioning church, and especially a functioning white church in Washington, D.C., was difficult to maintain. A lot of the conditions that undermined this church's success were transferred to the building. They said, this building is unnavigable, it's unfriendly. But yet when it was created only 2 decades before, it was greeted as a kind of triumph. I love this building because of the way it reflects what I think of as the kind of despairing case of religion, the kind of isolation that faith makes you feel, the kind of isolation that especially a Christian tradition encourages its worshipers to feel, to turn away, in a sense, from the world. This is what's replacing it. So I don't want to tell you it's ugly. It's designed by Robert Stern, and this isn't a great photograph. I picked it up from the Washington City paper, and I have no idea why they have such a bad reproduction in the story. But you've seen this building before. You've seen this condo building go up. You've seen this office building go up. You've been to the Noma neighborhood, and you know this building, and the difference between these structures is pretty vast. I will point out, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a kind of prism over the doorway. And when I saw that, I thought, why not just take that and wrap up this church building in a structure like that? Who's a Georgetown grad? Do we have any Georgetown people? What's this building? It's the Lounger Library. Do you love it? Nobody loves this library. This is a John Carl Warnke building, and I'm going to take this just meme off. Just go right back. It's not one of my favorites either, but I think that when you see it as he designed it, it's a transformation of Healy Hall. Everybody knows Healy Hall. Whether you went to Georgetown or not, you see it all the time. It's that beautiful, iconic Georgetown building. He was not, necessarily the architect was not necessarily a practicing brutalist, but he wanted to make a modern transformation of it. Once again, another building that has not been kept up very well over the years. This building is not in Washington, D.C., and it's not brutalist. It is the Fontainebleau, and it's designed by Morris Lapidus. It's actually the opposite of brutalism. It's a very kind of epic Miami, almost Art Deco, Beaux-Arts, sort of modernist tradition. Not everyone can work well in Washington, D.C., and sometimes an ugly building is just an ugly building. You recognize this as the sort of Georgetown Waterfront. This is the kind of outcome that you get when you turn everything over to Harvard GSD from the 1980s. Columns, arches, those are some of the tenets of postmodernism, a kind of recycling of all styles, thrown together, a kind of mashup. It was tempting for me when I first moved here to dismiss this entirely and think, this is the worst goddamn place I've ever been in my life. And part of that's just being Georgetown. But you know, over time I came to realize that in fact it's the things that I'm reading that I'm responding to. I'm just as privy to those impulses as everyone else, and if I'm eating just a diet of people tearing down postmodernism, then that affects the way I look at things. I have a much fonder view of it now. Arthur Cotton Moore is the architect who designed this thing. I find him to be a very special person. He designed an alternative for the Eisenhower Memorial that consists of, you know, the Eisenhower Memorial, Frank Gehry, it's a big controversy. Eisenhower Memorial that consists of two giant columns, one with a giant statue of Eisenhower as president, and the other with a giant statue of Eisenhower as military leader, and I think we definitely need to get on board with that. This is probably one of my favorite buildings in the entire world, and it's gone. This is the Morris Mechanic Theater in Baltimore. It's being torn down. I went to Baltimore for the first day of demolition. There's still some of the structure standing, I believe, but it's, for the most part, gone, just like the Third Church of Christ Scientist is gone. Demolition is a part of ugliness. I think demolition is the truest kind of expression of ugly. There's a great deal to be said about this building and a great deal to be said about Baltimore. And the fates of that city are very closely tied with the fates of this building. And it's sad, given that Baltimore is starting to thrive. It's beginning to move. It's Charm City once again, and not a nightmare city that people described it as for, you know, decades. But this building will be left behind. This is another one that we lost last year. This is the Prentiss Women's Hospital, designed by Bertrand Goldberg in Chicago. It's one of the funkier buildings that you'll ever come across. But what was really touching when this building was, when Northwestern University, the owner, was talking about demolition, many women who had given birth, who had given birth to children inside this hospital, came out to protest its demolition. Something about this pod structure and the central column and the way that services were distributed through this cloverleaf structure was something that many women found very, very comforting. And the pictures of the protests, although the protesters were few, were dominated by mothers with their children wearing shirts saying, "I was born here, don't tear it down." It wasn't just mothers. This is a kind of terrible inset that I made because I have never used a PowerPoint before. The architect Jeanne Gang designed what you see here in the inset as a way to save the Prentiss Women's Hospital. Jeanne Gang is a MacArthur-winning genius, probably the best American architect practicing at her age right now. And what she designed was amazing. She wanted to just put a building on it, like you'd put a bird on it. Why not? But Northwestern never gave it a hearing. There was not even a discussion. They wouldn't answer any phone calls about it. And you have to think about that, how it reflects on a city when one of Chicago's greatest architects steps up with a solution to save and redeem one of its iconic landmarks. but the owners won't hear it. So this gets down to one of my absolute favorites. It's the FBI building. You've all seen it. You've all walked under its dreadful shadow. I would say that no building in America reflects its mission better than the FBI building. There's simply nothing like it in the United States. Now that the FBI is actually moving out of its headquarters to, where are they going? To Maryland somewhere? We're going to lose this building. I'm not naive enough to even try to convince myself that there will be an effort to save it. But it's unique. Once again, this is a building that is so much larger than you. It is a mission that is beyond your ability to take in. It's not possible to see, a whole side of this building, much less understand what's going on inside this fortress. Unfortunately, like so many other brutalist buildings, it has been renovated so many times on the inside that it is completely unusable. One of the reasons people think these buildings are so ugly is because everyone in the 1980s insisted on putting drop ceilings into everything, and they did a very bad job of it at a time when cities had no money. Even the federal government couldn't get it right. Okay, I really appreciate all you guys coming out. I hope some ugly buildings are a little less ugly today, and that you will go by and give one of them a hug.